everybody. Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to have you. Great to have this turnout. So great that the snow has cooperated and is not falling just yet. I want to welcome everybody to this budget forum titled How Do We Protect Our Schools and Our City as we face yet another tough fiscal year. And I want to welcome our speakers and our guests tonight. Representative Peter Kocot, thank you so much for being here. Mayor Higgins, of course. Senator Stan Rosenberg is on his way. He'll be arriving at some point as we get another engagement in Deerfield. He will be here as soon as possible. And Joel Feldman from Yes Northampton. I want to thank the co-sponsors of this evening. The School Committee, City Council Conference Committee, with members of which are right here. Councilor President David Narkewicz, School Committee member Downey Meyer, and School Committee member Stephanie Pick. Also here, also not here, but part of that committee is Councilor Jesse Adams and School Committee member Alden Bourne. And it is co-sponsored with this committee and Yes Northampton, a volunteer group committed to working for sufficient public revenues to protect our basic services in the city of Northampton. So here we are, and I'm going to talk through the agenda because it is straightforward, and we want to keep it moving and keep us all engaged and have an opportunity for question and answer as well. We're going to start by hearing from the mayor. She's going to give us an overview of where the budget situation stands right now. Then we will hear from Representative Kocot, who will give us his perspective from a state level. Then, assuming Senator Rosenberg is able to get here, he will give his perspective. And actually, let me interject. From after the mayor speaks, before the state legislators, we'll hear from Joel Feldman of Yes Northampton about a proposal that is on the table to raise revenues for our services. Then the legislators, and then question and answer. And we had promised an hour-and-a-half meeting, 7 to 8:30. We got started a little bit late, but we will still commit to that 1 hour and 30 minutes. And have ourselves a good discussion with a sense of possibility and promise to change things and protect our basic services in our city. So with that, let me introduce the mayor. Thank you.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
We're awake. So I have a handout. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm very impressed with Representative Kocot. I have a handout that the first one, Pam's going to help me hand it out. It's 3 pages collated but not stapled. The first sheet has a very scary number as a deficit at the bottom. I'm going to explain to you why it's not that scary, because that's not the full amount. It's still a scary number, just not that high. I've been fiddling with it all day to try to, well, most of the afternoon to try to figure out how to tell the story. So this will help us tell the story of what's going on. Let me just say that the budget really has a couple things that drive the discussion about the formation of the budget. And one of the key ones that we wait for right at the beginning is there's a couple of big numbers that we have to know. One is our state aid number, and the second is usually the benefit number. That includes health insurance and pension costs. So those are the big numbers that kind of drive our budget. I just want to give you a couple little tidbits here. At the same time, from 2004 to 2010, or 2010, that our budget, general government, for instance, grew about 15% during that period of time. Employee benefits grew 68%, primarily driven by health insurance and our required pension payment. So we have done a lot to try to contain the cost of health insurance through work and very good work and collaborative work with our unions, but it's a problem that's a national problem. We can't solve it alone in the city of Northampton, and I know there's a number of people here who understand that unless there's a change on the national level about how we approach health insurance, and not just whatever has been done through the last year's health insurance reform, but something to do with controlling costs, we're all going to be in the same boat. I'm assuming that Representative Kocot is going to have something to say about that as well. So I have the general fund budget on top, but before we do that, can you go to the second and third pages? The second page, what I did here, the representative might need and these folks will need a set too. This page that has the bar graph, this is median increases in our budget over the last 10 budget years. So local taxes on average have gone up 3.7% a year. That includes the 2.5% allowed increase, whatever new growth we've had, new buildings, etc. And actually in that, because we did the median over that period, it includes the $2 million override. So if we hadn't had that override, that median increase would be lower. Next is charges for services, that 4.2%. Most of that's the Smith Voc tuition, which they've increased not every year, but many of the years that they've since 2000. Next is licenses and permits. Fines and forfeits down 2%. Now, if you got a ticket, that's where it is. Okay, our high point for tickets, which was about 4 years ago or 5 years ago, was about $1 million. This year we'll be lucky if we break $600,000. So, a couple things that happened. We made the system a lot friendlier. Those 15-minute parking spaces mean that when you run in to get your cup of coffee, you're not getting a ticket. But it also means that the city's not getting that revenue. State aid cherry sheet. At the same time, we went up at 3.7% a year in our taxes. Our cherry sheet state aid went up 2.5% a year, median increase. But there were a number of years where it went down a lot. So there was really, in that whole period of time, really 3 good years. And the rest of them were either level or going down. Other state aid down 15.7%, almost 16%. That has to do with all the small accounts that we used to get money for. The children who were in the custody of the state that we used to get money for, who were in the schools, DSAVE money that we used to get. There's a whole raft of programs that I know that Peter knows about too, that kind of just have disappeared over the last 10 or 11 years. Federal aid down about 1.2%, and we'll go down more this year depending on what happens with CDBG. This does not reflect school grants. This is only on the city side. And that also reflects the decrease in Medicaid billing that we've been able to do on the school. The schools bill for health services to kids. We get the money back. It comes back to the city. We pass it right through for the schools, but that number has dropped. Interfund operating transfers, that's sewer, water, and solid waste transfers to the city to offset the city's cost. Looks like a big number, and it is a big number, almost all driven by the health insurance of the people who are paid for on that fund. If health insurance went up 68%, that number is going to go up because we charge those funds for health insurance. Free cash, capital reserves. We started beginning of in 2000 not using any free cash. We had a period where we used a lot. We weaned ourselves off. We're back to using our reserves, and now we're zeroed out our reserves. We're not using them, but we're using a fair amount of free cash or undesignated fund balance to pay a couple accounts, and I'm going to talk about those in a second. And finally, miscellaneous revenues. Not a big number in the budget, and not predictable, we don't even count it when we report the revenues to the state because it just is not predictable. 1 year, for instance, when we had the special election when Senator Kennedy passed away, we had that special election, the state sent us some money. Another year, you're not going to get that money. You know, it's that kind of stuff. So that's just a snapshot. And the big takeaway for me on this is that we're funding more of our services than the state is. On average, we are putting more money into our services than the state is, and that's been true for most of the decade. The second page says, well, where's the money going? This is the one that says budget categories, looks like this. I just looked at personal services, which is people. What's the growth been from 04 to 10? Percentage growth in everything we spend on people, so that's all the salaries, the overtime, everything has been 2.6%. Well, people have gotten bigger raises than 2.6% in a few of those years, and many of our employees have gotten steps. So how have we kept it to that number? Some has been the years that people didn't get a raise. A lot of it's been layoffs. Make sense? Okay. Ordinary maintenance, 4.9% a year. Ordinary maintenance is everything that's not people, but it's not other than ordinary maintenance. How do you like that? That's gone up about 34%. That includes everything else, health insurance, pension, utilities, et cetera, et cetera. That's that number. So that's going up almost twice as fast as the cost for people. And then other than ordinary maintenance is primarily debt kinds of issues. Paying off debt, costs that are not yearly recurring costs. Does that make sense to folks? And that's gone down a bit. And that's primarily due, well, that's not quite right. They are yearly recurring costs, but they're not maintenance costs, they're capital costs. And it's gone down a little bit because we're paying off schools. And the cost of the schools is starting to go down. And the cost of the fire, they always do that, just before the person's supposed to talk, the PowerPoint goes off. There you go. So that's what that is. And there is a typo on that page, I apologize. So those are just some snapshots about the budget, so you have some idea of where the money's going, et cetera. So let's take the general fund. This is really a snapshot of the general fund budget, and it's a little misleading. So because everybody's eye goes to the bottom box. So let me talk you through from the top, okay? Right, taxes at the top, $46 million. That's all of our property tax, our excise tax, our personal property tax, the meals tax, all of those are in there. Okay, and that includes our increase, our allowed 2.5 increase, which is about $800,000, a little bit more, and the allowed we're budgeting about $500,000 in new growth, meaning new buildings, etc. The building permits are turning up a little bit. We're seeing some growth at the state hospital, so we feel comfortable almost budgeting $500,000. Joan Seraphin, the chief assessor, is a tad nervous, but she thinks we can make it. Charges for services, again, that's a number that is primarily driven by Smith School tuition, and there are some other charges for services in there. Fines and forfeits, we are going to keep the number that we had this year for parking tickets because we think the number was down this year because of how many parking spaces we lost during the snow. So we're going to try to keep that number and try to hope to get to that number again, both in tickets and in meter revenue. State revenue cherry sheet, that was cut this year. Our net cut on this, yeah.
What's a cherry sheet? Cherry
sheet. So I'm sorry, I should have explained that. Many years ago, right after the chisel and the stone, but before the computers, the state aid used to come on a pink sheet, and they called it the cherry sheet. Okay, so it comes in an email, which they don't make pink, but it's still the cherry sheet. And, so our cherry sheet aid is about $15,870,000, but we're losing a net of about $200 and something thousand there. I think it's 286. I think that's right. Federal revenue, that's the Medicare that I just mentioned, and then what we bill to the CDBG for city staff. That's mostly the people. That's almost all the people in the CDBG office, plus a day of the GIS person and 10% of their planning director salary. Interfund operating transfers I mentioned before, that's for sewer, water, and solid waste. This year we're cutting the last of the operating subsidy, or our cash contribution to the city budget. We got from the landfill, so we went from 467,000 or 68,000. We cut half of that last year. We're cutting the second half this year. So that's the end of that. And as soon as the landfill closes, you'll see that number drop because the people who are working for the landfill, we won't be able to charge the landfill fund for any either. Now, undesignated fund balance or capital reserves. Other years we've used money in the undesignated fund balance or in our reserves to help balance the budget, kind of like a rainy day fund. This year we can't do that. We don't have enough money to do that, to be honest. And we don't have anything in enough money in the stabilization fund to do that. We have some money in those funds. We need to hold on to them because the bond rating agencies are looking at how much we have in those funds. And if we're that close to zero, it's going to affect our bond rating, which affects how much it costs us to borrow. Now people say, well, don't borrow then. But we have to borrow to put roofs on buildings when the roof needs repairing. We have to replace vehicles that need to be replaced, to all those kinds of things that city governments need to do. We have a capital side of our house that we need to keep in order. And in fact, this last year we've invested over $6 million in energy improvements in the city. And the way that's going to manifest in our budget is we're guaranteed last year's energy costs for the next 15 years. And we're paying the borrowing that fixed this through the savings in the energy. So we this year are going to see some significant energy savings. Right now, we can't put them back into the budget because we have to pay the borrowing. But in the 5th or 6th year of the borrowing, and it's a 15-year borrowing, we're going to start to go positive. And that'll be able to be reinvested in programs. But if we don't have a good bond rating, we have to pay more to borrow that money.
Is the HUD money in there?
Yep, where it says federal revenue 293, that is primarily Medicaid with whatever we charge the budget for the people who work in CDBG. CDBG is run as a separate grant, but anything we bring into the city budget to pay salary benefits is reflected there. Okay? All right, that's our main sources of revenue. That's the sheet you're going to see every year. Here's what makes this year much more difficult. One-time federal and state grants, or one-time federal and state money. As a part of the stimulus program that the president did, we got money in IDEA, which is special ed. We got money in Title I, which is primarily for low-income children, reading and math. We got money in ed jobs, which was to keep teacher jobs. We got money in early childhood. And then on the state level, we have the circuit breaker money that we use to help offset some special education costs. We don't have this money this year. We had it last year. We don't have it this year. On both this Northampton public school side and on the Smith vocational school side, we don't have that money. So the total loss in grants there is the number you see, 1.240 million. It's a little bit more than some of the school people might be used to seeing because that includes the Smith vocational number. So total revenues available, 75,545,118, right? Because I'm backing out that subtotal. On the expenditure side, this is why the number at the bottom is tricky. Every day those numbers look a little different because every day we're meeting with department heads and saying, give me $40,000, give me $60,000. You need to cut X, you need to cut Y. So every day these numbers change. So this number for education includes a much lower cut than the total of this grant amount, okay? Because we're trying to make those grant amounts up across the entire city budget. If that total grant amount was taken just on the schools, I think the total was about 4.6%, and I know that Ms. Wright is here. Is that about right? 4.6%. It would mean a 4.6% cut to the schools. If we do it citywide, it's about a 1.4 to a 1.5% cut for every department. So that's the goal that we're working towards. So we started with a big scary number in this box, and that's the big scary number approximately that we started with. So what changed? We were able to start working down the numbers of these expenditures on the expenditure side. We've been working with the health insurance company, and we've gotten a very good number from them that it still needs to be negotiated with all the unions, but we have a good price for them. Actually, it's a 2.5% decrease with some plan design changes. We have we've done some work with every single one of these departments to try to push the number down. And so that's what's going on there. So then we have unappropriated uses. I just want to talk about that. The $400,000 there, we have to raise it through the taxes, but we're not allowed to spend it. So it's under our 2.5% cap, but we can't spend it on services. If anybody files for an abatement, it comes out of there. Okay, now there have been pushes in the past for the legislature to exempt the reserve from 2.5. And since 2.5 is, I guess, is the third rail in Massachusetts politics, that hasn't gone anywhere. State and county assessments, there is no county, but that's the historical name of that. We don't pay any money to the county. That is just state assessments. Primarily, there's money in there for PVTA. But the biggest assessments in there are for choice and charter. It's primarily school choice and charter school tuition. Cherry sheet offsets. I don't even know if I can explain this, but it's money that is taken back out from us on the cherry sheet to pay for other things someplace else. Susan, is there any clearer explanation of that?
It's PVTA and.
I thought PVTA was in the assessments. It might be in the offsets. But anyway, they're in there somewhere. I should, actually, I do know the answer. But other amounts to be raised. Those are all not that material. But see where it says unappropriated uses 44.6 million? We don't have a choice about that. So we can't cut that, right? It comes off the money that comes to us from the state before we even see it. So we get a gross number for state aid, and then they take this off. So then we get the net in the mail. Actually, they don't send a check anymore either. They don't send a cherry sheet or a check. Okay, there's our total proposed expenditures, $77,080,919, right? So then we have the fixed costs. What are the things we can't cut? Unappropriated uses, debt service. We're locked into debt service. We have. It's like your mortgage. You can't say, well, some people do, but you're not supposed to say, I'm not going to pay it. Employee benefits. We're locked into employee benefits. Look at our numbers up above under the expenditure summary. The thing we spend the most money on is schools. The next thing we spend the most money on is employee benefits. More than all of our public safety departments combined. So we can't cut that. Insurance and reserves, we really can't cut. That's our liability insurance, our workers' comp insurance, our police and fire comp, all that stuff. And then our capital program, I guess we could cut that, except that, again, we're back to the roofs and all those other things that need to be fixed. The van that drives the lunches from one school to another school, all those come out of that kind of money. So that's where we are. So then, what's available for us to reduce? Total proposed expenditures minus the total fixed cost, the amount of the budget that really can be reduced from is about $51 million. Okay? So then we have a $1.5 million problem, which is about 3%, I think. But we don't really, because Susan Wright is the finance director for the schools, who's sitting there in the back trying not to have me not ask her any questions, but we've already started making up that money here. Okay, so we've already started to take that money to try to make it up from these various budgets up here. So where we really are as a gap is in the $300,000 to $400,000 range now. And we're continuing to whittle away at that number. But we're still negative by that amount. And that's before we've booked any pay increases, any step increases, anything else. We're just trying to get to level, and then we'll figure out how we fund anything else. Okay? So, I think that's all I have to say. Is there a few more questions?
I'm actually going to, if it's okay, we're going to go straight through the presentations.
Okay.
So you all have the maximum information and then have an opportunity for questions of everybody who's offered you information. So, thank you. Sure. Thank you. So now we're going to turn over to Joel Feldman of Yes Northampton, who's going to give us one state solution that's out there.
Hi. I just want to talk for 1 second about Yes Northampton. We're a group that's been advocating for adequate revenues for city services, both on the school side and on the city side. And as you heard from the mayor, and as you probably read, we're looking at cuts. And the leadership of the House and Senate have basically said there are only going to be cuts, there's going to be no revenue. So we're going to talk for in another minute about what a revenue option would look like. But I wanted to spend another minute first on a little bit of how did we get here. We're obviously in the Great Recession, as they're calling it, so that's obviously what's going on right now. But between 1998 and 2008, we did some things on the state side that caused us not to be able to weather this particular bad storm as well as we might have. And I want to just go through that very quickly. One is that we reduced the income tax from 5.95% to 5.3%. That cost us $1.3 billion. We also reduced the tax rate on dividend and interest income, most of which is obviously received by high-income earners, from 12% to 5.3%. That cost $720 million. So those two things alone cost us $2 billion, money that we could have been using to prevent some of the cuts that have come in the last couple of years. Additionally, I just want to mention that the sales tax, as you know, did get raised very recently. But part of what's going on with the sales tax is with more services being part of the economy, those are not taxed under the sales tax. A lot of those services are exempt. And so that's causing total revenue from sales tax, other than the increase, to go down. But I want to focus a little bit on the income tax and the dividend and interest income. So we're down $2 billion, and that could have been used during this time period when we're having a harder time. I should also say, so even in fiscal year 2008, which was a good year, I think it was the last good year, if I'm not mistaken, we still had a structural problem with the budget. So even in the good year, we had cuts to be made. And if you've been listening to the mayor's fund presentations over the last number of years, it's always been cut, cut, cut. Basically, that's what we've been facing for years. So what can we do to prevent there from being just cuts? And I guess I want to say, really, there's no options. Either you're in favor of some revenue or you're in favor of all cuts. That's what it is. It means if you're not in favor of some revenue option, you're in favor of fewer teachers and fewer police and fewer fire and trying to make this all work as the mayor described. But that's a choice. If you choose not to increase revenue, you are choosing to make deeper cuts. And that's the stark choice. So what can we do about that? We have two handouts, one of which says an act to invest in our communities. Everybody have that?
For late arrivals, it's over at that table. Is that right? Well, if you want to just stand up and hold it out for those who might need it. Thank you.
So it's a two-sided handout. And this is a bill that's been sponsored by Senator Chang Diaz and Representative O'Day. And it's a bill to deal with some of what I just talked about. First, it would increase the rate on wage and salary income from 5.3 and bring it back to 5.95, what it was before. And because we don't have a graduated income tax, and we're probably going to talk about that in a little bit, we have a flat income tax, which means everyone pays the same rate. And constitutionally, we can't charge different income earners different rates. So what can you do to make it a little more progressive? You can increase exemptions, and that's what this proposed bill does. It would increase the single exemption from $4,400 to $7,900, and it would increase the merit exemption from $8,800 to $15,800. So that would mean that people with low incomes would get this large exemption in the beginning before they end up paying income tax. And the other thing that the bill would do is it would set the tax rate on interest, capital gains, dividends, and interest income. It would set it back to 8.95%, not all the way back to 12, but to 8.95%. That would be an increase for some forms of income, but it would actually be a decrease from others. And you can see, I'm not going to just read through the sheet, but you have the sheet here. What I want to spend a minute on is looking at that bottom graph there that you see. This bill would mean the lowest 60% of wage earners would pay less income tax. So I just want to say that again. When people look at it and go, tax is bad, in fact, 60% of people would get a tax cut. The next 20% would have a very small increase, on average $100 a year. So who would pay the taxes? The people that made out the most. When we did all these huge tax cuts, even on the federal level, everyone knows there was a big debate about whether people over $250,000 should keep their tax cut, and we all said yes. Well, we didn't say yes. It was decided for us. The answer was yes. So the folks who got the biggest tax breaks, in my mind, should now come back and help out. Shared sacrifice is what you hear when they talk about union workers and teachers. So it makes sense to me that the high-income workers should also share, because they're the ones who made out in the last 12 years or so. So this is a very progressive income tax, considering what the constitutional prohibitions are. So that's worth taking a look at there. On the back page, it shows who pays what percentage of the taxes. And under this proposal, even though the highest income earners would still pay a lower percentage of total taxes than poor people, believe it or not, and you can see the bar graph there, it would make it a little more equitable. So Yes Northampton is a big proponent of this act, and we're hoping at the end we're going to tell you what your possibilities are to do, what people can do here. But this is a bill that's before the House and Senate, and we think it's a bill that's going to help out. It's going to raise $1.2 billion in this particular form, and we think it would go some ways to prevent some of the cuts that we're looking at. We're going to get to the second sheet in a minute, but I also just want to say that Andrea Burns of East Hampton City Council wrote an op-ed about the bill. And this was reprinted from the Gazette, so it's worth taking a read at the end, and I'll turn it back to Pamela.
Okay. I also just want to add that our neighbor, Representative Ellen Story, is a co-sponsor of this legislation, and she would have been here tonight except that she's part of a House leadership meeting at UMass that our representative was left, thank you very much, to be here. Representative Story was not able to do that, but she is a co-sponsor of this bill, so I just want to make sure everyone is aware of that. So with that, Representative Kocot, thank you very much.
Thank you, Pamela. Let me start by thanking some people here. First of all, let me thank the Mayor of Northampton and the City Council and the School Committee for throughout, especially the last 4 years, during this great economic crisis, for doing so many great things with so little. So let's give them a little hand. Thank Pamela Schwartz for all of her outstanding work in opposition to question 1. And she just led that fight and just did a great job, and thank you for doing that, because if she hadn't done such a great job, we'd be in really bad shape. I know many of the people here today, but for those who don't know me and for those listening at home who might not have met me, let me just put my comments in context. I'm very biased about this particular issue in that I went to Jackson Street School, Florence Grammar, JFK School where we are tonight, Northampton High School. I have a son at Northampton High School. I have a son who graduated from there and is now in the public system at UMass Dartmouth. So obviously all of these issues directly impact my family. Let me just say, on a macro level, when you look at the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and you compare us, welcome Senator Rosenberg, when you compare us to other states in terms of every economic measure during this crisis, we are doing better than most states. And in fact, at this point in time, we are adding jobs more quickly than any other state except Texas. During this economic crisis, we have also managed to insure 98% of the population of Massachusetts. No other state has more people covered by health insurance than us. And, you know, many people would say, well, you're a politician, you're trying to, basically make your efforts look good. If you look at the independent arbiters of our economic situation in Massachusetts, which are the Wall Street bond rating firms, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch's, they have consistently said that Massachusetts, through its use of one-time revenues, cuts, reforms, consolidations, have done an excellent job, and in fact, have not only maintained our AA bond rating throughout this crisis, but Standard & Poor's is on the verge of raising our bond rating once again. So with the help of many different interest groups and parties, we've tried to make it through this tremendous economic downturn. Let me comment just a little bit on some of the comments that were made. When you look at those two big tax cuts that did happen, the income tax cut, the capital gains cut, those were not actions of the legislature. Those are the product of referendum questions that the voters of Massachusetts voted on. They, in fact, cut their own taxes. And so that $1.2 billion, whatever that number is, that is a number that the people of Massachusetts took a conscious step towards doing. Let me talk a little bit about sort of where we are today, and reference was made to the fact that I've been over at UMass all day, and the newspaper article that I'm going to quote, two politicians are going to breeze through Northampton and give an explanation of the budget. Well, we don't usually breeze through, we're kind of here all the time. So let me just correct that. And it made it sound like we were at this sort of a tropical spa. Let me tell you who was lecturing me today. Dr. Robert Paulin, Professor of Economics and co-founder of the Political Economic Research Institute. Dr. Jeff Thompson, Research Professor, same institute, UMass. Lynn Griesmer, Associate Vice President over there. We had a graduate level course today on all the stuff I'm going to talk to you about. So it was time well spent. And what we learned is that we are coming out of this crisis slowly, and it's going to be slow. And jobs are coming back. If you look at this past month's numbers, we're up about 15,000 more jobs. But if you compare us to the last big economic downturn, back to like the year 2000, we're still a couple of 100,000 jobs short. Nationally, if you take the population of our three biggest cities, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, multiply it times 2, you still don't come up with the number of people that are unemployed in this country, which right now is over 29 million. This is a national economic problem. We're doing better here, I think, because of the mix of ways that we derive revenue. And there's a lot of things that we are working on right now. But let me just give you a quick overview of kind of where we are. I normally don't do PowerPoints, but in terms of trying to aggregate data over long periods of time, I think it's going to be useful. All right, here we go. As I said, I don't do PowerPoints often. Massachusetts taxes are lower than the U.S. average, so that myth that we're Taxachusetts is not true. Back in 1977, it might have been. But if you make a comparison to the overall tax burden as compared to personal income, we certainly were high. Our taxes fell more than any other state during that time period, 1977 to 2008, 25.2% decrease. While spending has stayed mostly constant. And our spending, as you can see by this graph, is down about 0.3% overall as a percentage of personal income. Our state tax revenues have also gone down. When you look at tax revenues over that period of time, you can see a substantial decrease in revenues that we have to use on a myriad of state programs. How do we close the FY 2010 gap? We cut $2.2 billion out of the budget. So this myth of spendthrift Boston politicians, as you can see, is not quite all true. We received $1.6 billion in stimulus funding. We raised taxes by $609 million, and then used a few other smaller accounts. How do we close last year? As you can see, we relied heavily on the federal stimulus funding. $1.56 billion. Again, we did additional cuts, $744 million. We had some temporary sources of revenue, and we did some reforms that totaled about $48 million. Our gap coming into this year, and we talked about this a little bit, structurally is $1.89 billion. If you follow Washington politics at all, especially in the last month or so, what you've seen is, because of the sort of political tempest from last year's elections, the thrust down there right now is to cut virtually every discretionary program. The mayor talked about the numbers from HUD. Every city in Massachusetts right now is poised to be cut on their block grant funding, which is used for a lot of different purposes here in Northampton. Every discretionary program is going to be cut. So if you add those cuts into that $1.89 billion, our shortfall is much higher than that. And it's a moving target because we don't know how much those cuts are going to add up to. And based on what I've been reading, they can't cut enough. We have a net gap of 1.68, and as I said, that number is probably a little bit small. Just to maintain our programs from this past year, you add $970 million onto that. The revenue growth at this point, revenues are up, and there's a chart that I'm going to show you in a minute about that. The gap is still approximately 1.8 billion, pardon me, and that number is growing based on what happens in Washington. Governor Patrick, let me just talk about where we are right now. Governor Patrick has submitted his budget recommendations for fiscal year 2012. The House begins debate on our version of the budget the last week of April. The House budget will come out, I believe, April 13th, and the Senate will take up their budget sometime in May. The governor in his budget looks at that gap, and through cuts and savings, he comes up with $1.3 billion. Now, when you look at that document, House 1, and it makes a difference really who's in office, tends to be a political document as much as it is an actual fiscal document. And in that recommendation, he proposed cutting all publicly appointed attorneys and replacing it with a new publicly funded legal system with a savings of, I think, $45 million. Now, if we're going to add 1,000 new employees to the state budget, I'm really at a loss to figure out how that's going to save us money. But that's included within that. And there are other things like that in that budget, including a lot of health insurance cuts. He has some new revenues coming in, and as I said, that's his proposal at this point, and we will, of course, be working on our own. Education aid. This is a graph showing the trend since fiscal year 01, and you can see a 7.6% decrease. I believe in House 1, he has an increase in Chapter 70, but he cuts much of the other local aid accounts that the mayor was talking about earlier. No state cut more education aid during this crisis than Massachusetts on a percentage basis, 3.7%. Local aid, as you look at it and include inflation, since FY01, it's a 47% decrease in all local aid accounts. Early education and care. Today we were briefed on a study that has been done over the last 20 years by a team of sociologists. What they did was they accurately followed a group of infants through the period of time that they were young adults, looking at whether or not they were ever on welfare, graduated from college, and owned a home. Those three indicators. Those students in the control group that received a very, very advanced level of early childhood education outperformed the control group dramatically. So in terms of making healthy communities and an economic system that has, you know, a good chance of growing over time, it just points out that early education and child care becomes an incredibly important factor in what we're trying to do. But as you can see, we have decreased the funding for that 23% since FY01. Higher ed, 32% decrease since 01. Public health, 29%. The environment, 25%. When we're looking at some of the issues we're going to be talking about tonight in a tax system, my colleagues and I are trying to look at a system that's adequate, stable, simple, efficient, and fair. And we're going to talk about, I have some modeling here that I'm going to try to get to quickly, that looks at some of the scenarios, including the 5.95, that looks at the entire economic scale and really points to the fact that the graduated income tax is actually the most progressive way to move forward in taxation. Currently, state and local taxes are regressive. If you look at people that make less than $19,000 and compare it with people that make over $500,000, percentage of personal income paid in state and local taxes has much more of an impact on people making less money, which is obviously very logical. The property tax is especially regressive, but the property tax ends up being the major tax that localities have to fund their budgets. So as part of any public policy that we attempt at tax reform, we've got to find a way to lower the burden of property taxes in every community. The sales tax, which we passed, the increase, is also not a great tax. And if you look at this, it's pretty clear from this graph the impacts. Who pays sales taxes in Massachusetts? When you look at that population making less than $19,000 a year, they pay a disproportionately high portion of their income as part of the sales tax. The income tax in Massachusetts, though, is relatively progressive at this point. You can see the impacts there, and that's because of some of the amendments that we've made to the earned tax credit and other laws that we've passed in the past several years. This shows from 1991 to the year 2010, the trend of the personal income tax rate in Massachusetts, starting out at a high of 6.25 to the current 5.3. Could it be more progressive? And this graph speaks to the scenarios that we're going to be talking about in a minute. Dividend income. When you look at who derives the most from that, obviously it's the people in the highest tax brackets. Tax expenditures. What is that? Massachusetts, if you buy a box, there's no sales tax on it. If you're a Raytheon and you sell a missile system made in Massachusetts to Israel, there's no sales tax on it. Fidelity, when they sell a mutual fund to somebody living in New Hampshire, there's no sales tax on it. So we have all these little tax breaks that, when you look at them, some of them make sense, some of them don't. And there's a great movement right now in the legislature to try to evaluate each and every one of them, to take out the ones that don't make sense, to add to the ones that do, that create more jobs. And in those cases where we've given a company a tax break and they don't fulfill their responsibilities, like providing more jobs, we're going to be trying to claw back those benefits from them. Michael Widmer, the head of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, just a couple of days ago, indicated in an article, I think in the Boston Globe, that the legislature should move very slowly on that issue because there are 170,000 people employed in Massachusetts in the financial services industry. And if we were to move to immediately take away those tax benefits, it would impact a major source of income in Massachusetts. And so we have to very carefully evaluate all of these proposals. Some really good websites. If you folks want to go on and learn more about this on your own, massbudget.org, massbudget.org online, and the Commonwealth of Mass's budget is online as well. The Senate has a website with their budget, the House has a budget as well. I'm going to at this point turn it over to Senator Rosenberg, but in the meantime I'm going to scroll to a series of screens that after perhaps he's done, we can talk about some of the scenarios and the impacts, because it's very interesting once you actually start to plug them in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. And welcome, Senator. Thank you for making it over here. I know it was a stretch, so.
Happy to be here. Great. Well, thanks for the invitation. I was asked to be upbeat tonight, so I thought I would go out and get a pair of Groucho glasses or something, so that as I gave you the bad news, that it might be a little bit lighter. But you know, the picture is, as Peter laid it out, is still pretty grim. We think this is the last really, really bad budget of this recession. Going to cut somewhere on the order of $1.5 billion, and the revenues are starting to rebound quite healthily. I mean, $1 billion base revenue increase in 1 year is not insignificant, but it's just not enough to close that gap, given how much federal money got put into the base of the budget that was given to us basically as, quote, one-time money. We had 3 fiscal years, state fiscal years, over which we could spend it, and it's now basically all gone. In the Senate leadership meetings now, we've had 4 Senate leadership meetings in the last 5 weeks, and whenever the issue of revenues comes up, which I know is undercurrent and theme of this meeting, basically there are blank stares around the table, and people understand that we're not going to grow out of it through revenue at this point and be able to do anything significant this year, but because we've got to close the structural deficit. But there's a general feeling of optimism and hope about the FY13 budget, and so so far there's been no willingness among the Senate leaders to discuss any serious efforts to do any kind of revenue this year. Some of you know that I filed a constitutional amendment to try once again to get on the ballot and get the voters to consider a graduated income tax. As Peter pointed out, our system is relatively progressive given the exemptions, deductions, the earned income tax credit, the stuff we've done on college tuitions and loans, and even the circuit breaker for senior citizens. But on balance, it is not it's not a progressive tax in Massachusetts. It could be worse, but it could be a lot better if it were truly a graduated income tax. It takes 4 years to do this. In the current 2-year term, there has to be an affirmative vote by a majority of the House and Senate meeting together in a constitutional convention, and then it has to happen again in the next term, and then it goes on the ballot in 2014 if we get that second vote. If we don't get a vote at all this year, or if it fails this year, we can try again the next term, but not the next year, but the next term, and so then the earliest it could be on the ballot would be 2016. Each time it's appeared on the ballot, and it has a number of times, in the 20th century, never in the 21st century, and each time it failed, but it failed by a larger margin. My hope and my framing of the issue at this point is that this question was before the voters in the 20th century during a period of time when the economy was continually growing, people's standard of living was growing, people saw their lives getting better and believed that it would happen without end, and therefore they too would soon be middle income and then upper middle income and then wealthy. But the reality is that the last couple of decades, the average wage earner, the average worker, whether it's blue collar, white collar, minimum wage, their standard of living has stagnated, and in fact it's dropped. And only the very tiniest, that 1% that you can see on all of Peter's charts at the end, those are the only folks whose standard of living is actually improving. And millionaires are becoming multimillionaires, and multimillionaires are becoming billionaires, and billionaires are becoming multi-billionaires, and soon we'll have our first trillionaire. And so this is a question of, can we get the voters of Massachusetts to vote in their own interest and understand that a fair taxation system is really only possible when you have an income tax by having a graduated income tax. And then we can set about the business of designing that system and designing one that's fair and reasonable and produces the adequate revenue that Peter had up on his slide there in sufficient amounts delivered or collected in as fair a way as possible that meets our needs to be able to support the public services that people want. And not on Peter's slide, but I will add to it, I attended a briefing in Washington about 4 or 6 weeks ago now, and unfortunately it was a very sobering day, and it was organized by the National Conference of State Legislatures for legislative leaders around the country, and I was the one representing Massachusetts, and the data that they presented was just absolutely frightening, and I'll just summarize it this way. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, those 3 programs, all of which I think people in this room would agree would be fair, reasonable, and important social programs that everyone in the country has an opportunity to participate in and should be able to benefit by. By 2040, those 3 programs will consume every penny of federal revenue. every penny of federal revenue. So the federal government, which in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s prior to Mr. Reagan, did a lot of revenue sharing programs and did a lot of partnerships with states, with cities and towns, and over the course of 3 decades now, they've basically all but disappeared. They're a shadow of themselves now. And the states get, except for health care, the states get very little federal money. We do get some benefit in Massachusetts because we have defense contractors, for better or for worse, and because we have the largest, densest collection of research and teaching hospitals in the country per capita, and we have the largest public higher education concentration per capita in the country, and both of those result in us getting a substantial amount of competitive money that is in the research realm, and so we do get some benefit from that, and give good product and good return to the federal government, to the country, and to society as a whole on the research side and medicine and social and all of that. I'll leave the military discussion aside, but the amount of federal money is dropped dramatically over time, and the revenue sharing has really diminished. And at the same time, as the mayor will tell you and the city councilors will tell you, those darn state mandates, well, you know, they are real, they do happen, but they also happen at the federal level, being handed down to the state, and then the state has to implement these, and many of them, unfortunately, involve municipal government as well. We administer them, but they're actually set and made in Washington. Clean water and sewer programs and things of that nature, which they provide little or no money for, but pass down significant regulation, and we have to enforce it. So I'm not saying we haven't been guilty of creating some ourselves, but the point simply is that the federal government has handed off to the states significant responsibilities that used to be federally funded, which the citizens demand that we continue, and so we have to keep working to try to find resources to maintain those programs, as well as the programs that people ask Massachusetts to create for its citizens out of the state government. And we've been through 3 recessions during my time in the legislature. Each has been worse than the previous one, and each has been longer and deeper than the one before. There's a change in our economy, there's a change in the world economy, and we as a country and as a world haven't figured it out yet, and we don't really know how to manage this. And with each recession, the cuts get deeper, and that means the hole that we have to dig out of is deeper. And so I'll just finish by just, you know, this quote that many of you have heard me use before is still very apt, and maybe even more apt now than when I started using it 20 years ago. De Tocqueville said he sees in the American people the potential to vote themselves more benefits than they're willing to pay for. And we have reached that point. We are unable to convince the voters to allow for levels of taxation and even changes in the tax system to make it fairer and more progressive, so that the burden is distributed in proportion to the benefit that has been created by this economy, where the wealthiest among us are just getting enormously more wealthy without having to contribute back some of that revenue. And by the way, a significant portion of that revenue is not generating new wealth. It's just moving wealth up the chain and putting it into fewer and fewer hands. And it's one thing if it's actually creating new wealth, but these schemes that keep getting us into these deep, deep recessions are often driven by the schemes that are created by people to create wealth without create income for wealthy people without creating new wealth. And as a society, we have to figure out how to stop that. And when the citizens vote over and over again for people to cut taxes, get rid of government programs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and when they consistently work to put questions on the ballot more often than not, we've been defeating them in Massachusetts, but that's mainly because they go too far. And in fact, that's been the slogan on several of these, is they go too far. I maintain that if they had tried to roll back the increase that we did in November's ballot question, they would have won. The fact that they got greedy and tried to move it down to 3%, the people saw through that and said that was not good. We can't afford that much. But I maintain that had they just put it on the ballot as roll back the 1.25%, I believe it would have passed. And there is a great difficulty in convincing people that the services that they asked us to provide are paid for with the taxes and the fees that they pay. They think that the services are paid for by government, and they do not want to pay taxes. Let the government pay for it. And people actually say that to us. People will call to get help, to get their kid into a public college, or to get mom in a nursing home, and then say, by the way, don't cut my taxes. I mean, don't raise my taxes. Don't raise my taxes. I'm paying enough. Well, you're just about to ask me to get the $36,000 a year bed for your mother. May she live many years, and how are we supposed to pay for this? So, I'm sure there'll be questions, and we'll go on. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to, if it's a few minutes so we have room for Q&A, that
Sure.
would be great.
Let me just touch on just a few positive things that are happening right now. We talk about taxes all the time. It's in revenues and ways to come up with more jobs. And in the House at this point, we now have a progressive caucus. That caucus is looking at a number of proposals out there, and later this month we're going to be making some recommendations on what we feel might be some positive steps. Number two, I think part of the challenge of this group and legislators and people that want to make sure that we have revenues for important services is to educate people. Many people don't have time to research these things. And I think when people are shown the importance of these programs, how we're paying for them, and the real costs, I think many people say, well, you know what, I have an uncle, he wants me at the Soldiers Home. I understand that we have to have, adequate taxes for that. I want my road plowed. I want my kids to have 25 kids in a class and not 95. When people make that connection, I think that they're more prone to support us with these tax votes. The Federal Bank in Boston just came out with a great research paper. And if you go online, it's online right now. And we have filed legislation related to it. And what it shows is, it takes every community in the Commonwealth, looks at their ability to raise revenue, looks at what they've got to provide locally for services, looks at poverty levels, and basically comes up with a number, an actual number for each community on the gap in aid. In Northampton, the gap in aid right now, what we should be providing in Northampton is substantial. Other communities, if you look at a Chatham and primarily resort communities, they can raise funding much more easily than a place like Northampton or a Boston or a Holyoke. And so for the first time, legislators now have a really solid piece of good research that we can take home and basically say, you know what, you should be getting a lot more state aid. These are the numbers, and this is our plan to get to that point over 5 years. Legislation has been filed, and we're all working on it very, very hard. During the economic crisis, who won in that crisis? I'll tell you who won. The commercial banks won. If you look at the amount of money they had in cash prior to that crisis and compare it to right now, nationally the commercial banks are sitting on $1 trillion. Now if you're a small business in Amherst or Northampton and you're trying to expand, your biggest challenge isn't the local tax rate. It's having access to capital. You need capital. Steve Grossman, who's our new treasurer, is going to go to every city and town. And he's going to be meeting with virtually every bank. And what he wants them to do is to start to set up a system to inject more capital into every community so that local businesses can expand and add jobs. The other thing is loan guarantees. If we can do a small loan guarantee for some of these transactions, we can make them happen. And so these are all things that we are working on right now. And you know, clearly, as was talked about today, coming out of this thing, it could be a U, where we hit the bottom and come out sort of like this. It could be a V, we bounce out really quickly, which is what we all want to see happen. Or it could be an L. And that bottom of that L just keeps going on forever, and that's what we don't want to do. So we are working very, very hard to come up with creative ways to raise revenue, to get non-governmental entities involved in this solution. And I don't want to go really deep into the weeds, but really quickly, I just want to show you just a real quick, just sort of overview of one of the proposals. When you look at changing the average income tax rate up to 5.95, and you increase the personal exemptions to say $6,800, okay, you'll see that the impact of that group making $19,000 roughly or less, their taxes obviously are lower. At the higher income level, it goes up. However, and that raises approximately $780 million. So if you think about the 780 and you compare it to that gap that I was talking about of like 1.9 billion, you're still not out of the woods, but you're getting there. However, it's still regressive. And when you look at it as a percent of personal income in terms of the ultimate impacts, you're still not really solving that problem for the lower income population. And this analysis is online at the website I talked about, and anyone who wants access can look at all the different scenarios. Bottom line, graduated income tax is really the most progressive way to go in terms of that particular tax. And I'll leave it at that because I know there's probably other questions.
Just one point about the piece that Peter was talking about, the Federal Reserve, a group of local officials, state officials, and mass taxpayers along with the Federal Reserve. I was one of them that sat down in a room every morning, every couple weeks for about 6 months and hammered through this formula and came up with this formula that now is sitting at the State House. And it really takes a fundamental difference in looking at how we need to do local aid funding. It doesn't look at Chapter 70. It's a Chapter 70 school aid. This just looks at non-Chapter 70 municipal aid, which is something that hasn't been looked at, quite frankly, since the Kocot administration. So it needs to be done. But concurrently, or very soon afterwards, a fundamental relooking at the Chapter 70 program is necessary, especially with all of these wild cards that have now been introduced into the Chapter 70 program, like these innovative schools and the change in charters and all those other things that are making it really hard for communities to plan over the long run for how to fund their schools. I applaud the legislature for picking up that work that's being done on the Federal Reserve side, but we're woefully overdue to look at the foundation budget to figure out if what we're spending on students is right, and then figure out how to do it. And finally, I want to say about that, the aid that went, all of the new aid, the Boston Foundation came out with a study and saw that basically almost all of the new aid that went to Boston for schools went to health insurance. It didn't go into the classroom for teachers. It went to teachers in the form of health insurance, but it didn't allow for the addition of programs or anything else. So unless, that's the third piece that can't be solved on the local level, unless we get cost control and health insurance, we're going to be where Senator Rosenberg's talking about, where every dollar is going to pay for health insurance and pay for other of those kinds of things. We have to do something about that.
Okay, thank you. We now are going to turn it over to you. Jane Fleischman, another volunteer from Yes Northampton, has volunteered to moderate the question and answer period. So she'll provide the mic so you're on television and those at home can listen as well. And in the spirit of maximizing our minutes together in the exchange. Let's all make our questions brief and our answers brief, and know that we can continue to follow up in different forums afterwards. So with that, questions?
Questions or comments? So you've heard about the local picture. You've heard about the act to invest in our communities that Joel Feldman was talking about. You heard about the tax expenditure budget and all the loopholes. You've heard about other models. You've heard about the graduated income tax that Stan and Peter were talking about. And in every part of the country this is going on. There's budget shortfalls everywhere, and there are people getting angry everywhere. And so if you are feeling like you just want to say a comment, that's all right as well. But we got very little time, so try to keep it short. And want to get started?
Just a question at the state level about corporate taxes and the possibility of raising corporate taxes. Just speak to that, please.
I think what's going to happen is it's going to be a review now of those tax breaks, the things from Fidelity and Evergreen and all of that. I don't see it going beyond that at this time.
Please.
I would like to hear some more comments about the act to invest in our communities. It seems to me that that is the right thing to do. It's fairly aggressive. Reading between the lines, it sounded like our representatives are saying, well, it's not going to happen. I think that's absolutely true. It won't happen if it's not aggressively advocated for by our representatives. I'd like to hear why you wouldn't advocate for it aggressively.
I was a co-sponsor with my Senate colleague of the meals tax for many years prior to its passing. I was a co-sponsor with my Senate colleague with the increase of the alcohol tax. I've been a co-sponsor of virtually every amendment to increase the income tax. I'm a co-sponsor of his bill to institute a graduated income tax. I voted to increase the sales tax. I voted to increase the alcohol tax. You're looking at a liberal Democrat who's in favor of raising additional revenues. The challenge here, though, is not us. The challenge is that when I look at the House of Representatives, and I'll just talk about the House for a minute, 160 members. Out of that 160, I can tell you accurately right now that there are maybe 22 votes for that measure, me included. The challenge becomes for this group to start to talk with your relatives and your neighbors and your employees and employer about that connection between necessary state services and local services and how we pay for them. And every community has to have that conversation. Everyone has to get into the weeds like we were doing tonight a little bit and look at how we got here and what the real causes are. I mean, how many conservative talk shows have you heard conservative politicians saying it's these fat cat public salaries that are causing all these budget deficits? You know what? All the research shows that public sector employees compared to private sector employees that are the same age and the same job make at least 4% less than private sector employees. The real cause of this was the fat cats on Wall Street that put us in this position. But it's an education process. It's an education process because legislators represent their districts and represent their neighborhoods and represent the people who vote for them. Those people need to come to this understanding, and it's not an easy process. It takes a lot of hard work, and that's reality.
I'll add three things briefly. First, in terms of specific steps beyond educating your fellow citizens here and elsewhere, the bill is in the Taxation Committee. If it doesn't come out of the Taxation Committee, we don't vote on it. So the first target has to be to look up all of the members of the Taxation Committee and to work to create a majority on that committee. If the bill comes out, it will then go to the House Ways and Means Committee because all revenue raising under the Constitution must start in the House. So therefore, if it's a Senate bill or a House bill, it doesn't matter. It will go to the House Ways and Means Committee. Then the next target is to get those 33 or 4 people to find a majority to move it out to the floor. Now, if that doesn't work, or if you want to try to take a shortcut, then you have to try to add it to a piece of legislation that's already moving through. The only logical piece of legislation that you can try to add it to that's moving through is either a bill that's coming to the floor to cut taxes, and then you can decide to try to add taxes, or a bill that might be used to try to correct the problems with Evergreen and Fidelity and all of that. So there's a tax vehicle moving through, so you can try to use that vehicle. And there's more likely to be a bill of that sort coming out than a tax increase from the committee. But let's not give up the possibility that a tax increase could come out of the committee in the form of the bill you just mentioned. Now, let's assume that neither of those paths work. The third option is to try to add it to the budget. That debate's going to take place in the House, as Peter said, in about 3.5 weeks. That's not a lot of time to try to organize, but that's a possibility. It could at least be a test vote. It could be an opportunity to raise the issue. It could be an opportunity to try to test and see who's where. Then, if it passes the House, in any of those three ways, gets to the Senate, then we can do it. If it doesn't pass the House, the Senate cannot initiate a bill to raise taxes. That's under the Constitution. Because taxation is the purview of the people, and the branch that's the closest to the people is the House of Representatives. The second and final thing that I'll say, because I know we want to move on to others, is just look at what happened in the last election. While we defeated the rollback of the sales tax, the Worcester delegation, which was almost all Democratic, is now almost all Republican minus one. One Democrat survived. The Republicans and the Tea Party are on the move. There are already two people in Hampshire County, two legislators, who already have a Republican Tea Party person who's actually already organized a committee to run against us in the next election. That's not going to dissuade people from legislators from Hampshire County from doing the right thing. But I'm just saying, this is how organized the right is now, and they are chomping at the bit. They are so excited that they've doubled the number of Republicans in the House, and they're ready to do more.
So Stan, thank you for that good organizing strategy to get people from Yes Northampton to remember it.
That's the closest I can get to being upbeat.
I hear you. We got like 1 minute left. We got
along that line.
Quick.
Peter, you said that a lot of this is our own doing, the making of our own doing. The voters' referenda tend to dictate tax law in this state. Stan, you actually have, not only are you proposing graduated income tax, you're also proposing a way to circumvent the heavily moneyed influence in referenda votes and ballot questions. That there's no longer a grassroots thing. It's a thing that's being heavily subsidized by moneyed interests. And can you explain how that might work?
Yeah, I'll try to do this very briefly. There's two separate bills. One would require more regulation of paid signature gatherers so that we can try to prevent fraud, which has already happened in Massachusetts on at least one ballot question has been proven fraud. I think there's actually two. And so we're taking the best practices from around the country about making them register. The companies have to register and get a license. If you're going to employ people who collect signatures, the people who collect the signatures have to wear a badge and have to be licensed. And every paper that is submitted has to be indicated who actually collected the signatures, so that if there are fraudulent signatures, somebody can be held accountable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The second bill, which is much less popular, and probably with some of you as well, is the current standard, the current method for determining how many signatures are required to put a question on the ballot was changed in the 1950s. And it's 3% of the people who voted in the last presidential election, if that was the last election, or gubernatorial election, if that was the last election. So it's 65 to 70,000 signatures typically required. If we applied the standard based on the population and the number of voters in place in Massachusetts in the 1950s, it would require 130,000 signatures. What's happened is the population has grown, voter participation has dropped. As a result of the drop in voter participation, the total number of signatures required is artificially low. We are the lowest in the country. We require the fewest signatures of any place in the country. And that makes it possible for out-of-state and wealthy interests to come in and use Massachusetts. And if you start researching the ballot questions over the last 10 or 15 years, you will see that a significant number of those questions were actually written. They found the 10 people in Massachusetts to sign it. They then paid the signature gatherers to collect the signatures and then got it on the ballot and financed the campaigns. Bilingual education, you can't do selling horses for horse meat, which we do not do in Massachusetts, but they wanted to win in the state, and they thought Massachusetts would be a state that would do it. As it turns out, that was a ballot question that was fraudulently, they did fraud in signature gathering, so it never got on the ballot. So that's basically what Bill's giving me the opportunity to explain. There's these two bills, and we'll see if we can get any momentum behind it.
Anybody else?
I got one quick thing I'd like to say, if you don't mind, before we all go see a man about a horse. You heard a lot of stuff about what could happen at the state level, but we have to have a budget to the council by May 5th that has to be balanced and voted on by the beginning of July. So we still have a gap to cut. None of the solutions, almost none of the solutions that have been offered tonight are going to solve those problems. So we're going to have hard conversations with department heads, hard conversations with unions, hard conversations with the community as we look at what are our paltry remaining revenues that we might be able to increase. So stay tuned.
Well, let me just first say that because we did start a little late, I want to, if there's any other pressing question out there, I want to give an opportunity for it to be asked, and then we can wrap up.
What can we do?
Locally,
Okay.
state.
I'm happy to do that. Okay. Thank you. So what I want to clarify in this segment to what we can do is, Mayor, I understand we have to create a budget within this timeline. However, if additional revenue is passed and comes into the state and gets funneled down to the local communities, the budget then gets adjusted like it has many times years in the past. Does it not after? I mean, like at the end game.
Let me explain that. We really are pretty much set with the budget we get in July. If we get additional revenue, we can make some adjustments before we set the tax rate, usually in November to December. But it's really difficult, especially in the schools, to change the budget once you set the budget in July, because classrooms get set, schedules get set, everything else gets set. So the reality is that is probably not likely. We're going to have a number in July, and that's the number, or a number for July. Now there was years when not since I've been mayor, but well, actually I think there was one year where Finneran and Birmingham sat on the balcony till like November. And we used we projected a number and used that number, and the number it didn't end up being that much different. So we have had a little bit of additional revenue come in sometimes. We changed, then we add it back when we set the tax rate. We very rarely actually do that. I think that one of the first years we did it was last year. We haven't done it that often. So.
Okay.
You'll have a pretty good idea of what the local aid number will be by the last day in April, because at that point, the House will have concluded our process on the budget. But just prior to that, the Senate and the House typically will get together and come up with a number that both branches utilize as their local aid numbers.
And in our case, in the Senate caucus today, we discussed this, and the Senate President and the Senate Ways and Means Committee Chair said that they may, underscore may, be ready to have that discussion next Thursday with us.
And just as a long-term observer of this, when mayors are up for election, there tends not to be a dramatic increase. When state legislators are on the ballot, which is in the off year of mayors, they like to think that the mayor's in the off year, but I'll just put it the other way. There tends to be a bigger bump in local aid.
Well, and next year we hope there will be more.
There you go. I rest my case.
So do you.
On April 7th, a legislative group is going to meet to talk about this proposal that we were talking about tonight.
This coalition of communities.
Yes.
Okay. Great. Well, and so let me in closing, give a little overview of, I'm sort of wearing both my city councilor and Yes Northampton hat at the same time. Want to make sure that everyone is aware that this legislation that Joel talked about earlier, that you've got a faction on, is part of a statewide campaign. Coalition for Our Communities is the umbrella. It is a very, very large umbrella. It's the same umbrella that led the fight to defeat question 1, the rollback of the income tax, and defeat the rollback of the sales tax last year. There is a campaign, and we are charged with the opportunity, and I would argue responsibility, to plug into that campaign as a community. And I will tell you what they are suggesting is, first of all, we could really show our strength by getting to Boston, crossing that divide. There is a hearing on May 5th. It's on the back of your sheet at 10:30 in the morning. There is a sign-in sheet at the back, and let me just say that if you are interested in being part of that, we could really make it fun. We could carpool, we could get a bus, we could really have a good time with this and show our strength from Western Massachusetts. So put your name down. And for those who are viewing, please feel free to email me. You can find me on the City Council website, pschwartz77@gmail.com. So I am happy to be the conduit to connecting around this. We also, well, I would say call your state senator and representative, but how handy, and very grateful for you to be here. But continue the dialogue, as I'm sure you'd welcome it. And so continue to be in touch. The other thing I'll be talking about with my city council hat on is passing a resolution in Northampton in support of it. I'll be again talking about that more with my colleagues and with all of you. And spread the word on it. I mean, this is an opportunity. The bottom line is, we've seen change happen where it's least expected, right in our country, much less the world. I mean, it's fresh at our fingertips. What is taking place in Wisconsin? What is taking place across the planet in terms of could never happen? It would never happen. It's happening. It's happening. So why can't it happen here? Why can't we make it happen here? I would challenge us all that we can. And so let's start together by organizing ourselves, making our voices heard, that we believe in the good that government does. We believe that taxes are essential for the basic services and quality of life that we all depend upon and we all deserve, and we can make that happen. So I encourage you to join us. And thank you very much. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for educating us. It really is such a critical piece of this puzzle. So thank you.